Welcome, everyone. In this episode of Remember Her Name podcast, I have the pleasure of talking to Dr. Lisbeth Deacon, a researcher, curator, art and photography teacher in Lucas School of Arts, campus in Lucas, Brussels. Welcome, Lisbeth.
Hi, Julia. Thank you.
We'll be talking about Maria Wierusz-Kowalska, better known as Tapta, who was a sculptress working mainly with textiles. Tapta was born in Poland in 1926. Then, during the Second World War, she emigrated to Belgium, where she stayed until her death, setting aside her travels to Africa in the meantime. And we'll focus on her work Cocoon, created in 1973. It is quite a big installation that hangs above the carpet, so the vertical and horizontal elements sort of interact with each other. And at first, I wanted to ask you about the technical aspects of this work. How was it made? Was it weaved, or are there any other elements holding the structure together?
It was actually not weaved, but made by thick white cords of cotton and linen, sewed together with a needle in a concentric way, so they form a surface that is then hung on a hook attached to the ceiling. So she actually works with the soft characteristics of the material and also with gravity to achieve the form she wanted. And actually, these cords very much look like those rough ship ropes you can buy in a shop, but in fact, they are especially made for her. It are multiple threads of cotton twisted into 3 strands. So in fact, they are not rough at all, although they look like that, but soft and very much inviting to touch. And I think here, this is the first important characteristic of the work of Tapta. It's tactile quality. So immediately in this work, it's a good work to introduce her work because it already shows this quality of her practice. And also very important, I think, is that instead of classically woven tapestry, this work is hung in the middle of the room, so it becomes spatial. It becomes a sculpture rather than a classical tapestry or textile work that is traditionally hung on the wall and in a more two-dimensional way.
So before this sculpture, did she make more of these kind of tapestries before she started to create such spatial works?
Yes, indeed. She made more mural works that were more traditional, but already there she tried to integrate other elements. For example, she integrated little pieces of copper to, reflect the space or reflect the light that is in the space in the work. So there is already a very minimal interaction between the work and the space, and that is something she will definitely develop in her later work. Also, sometimes she leaves some threads open, let's say, and there allows some transparency in the work.
What do you mean that she leaves them open? Like there's a composition and then she just like leaves loose threads, or what do you mean by that?
No, actually, she shows the work the way it comes off of the loom. Instead of making a nice border, let's say, and finish it nicely, she leaves the threads that were attached to the loom, she leaves them visible and shows them like that. For example, you can see through the work and see the texture of the wall.
Okay. So she's kind of also showing the process of how she was making it, and it's not so, the result is not so perfected artificially because it's showing her process of working by these threads that are left.
It indeed kind of gives insight in the way of working, but especially I think her main focus is this interaction between the work and the material and the space.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that is already there in a very small way, but that she will develop further in later works that become more spatial, like is Cocoon, for example.
And does this interaction with space also extend to the interaction with the viewers? Because that was also a thing that I was interested in whether this work was presented somewhere, and it is a cocoon, and it's pretty big, so I was wondering whether the viewers could actually interact with the work. And you also said that it was soft and it was tactile, so I was wondering whether people could actually see it from a close-up and touch it, or like climb inside. Maybe it sounds a bit it's not usually possible, but I was wondering whether you could actually come into full contact with the work.
It's a good question, because it was indeed something important for her, this interaction with the viewer. Although in this work, the interaction is limited to, let's say, an invitation to touch the work, but nothing more. You cannot climb in it and sit in it. This will change, however, in later works that she will make. All these works were, in fact, shown in the same year as they were made, in 1973, in a solo exhibition she had in the city of Ghent in Belgium. So yes, it was immediately presented to a public who could indeed interact with them. And to give you an example of a work that came after Cocoon and that is really inviting to interact with, is Tente à causer, is the title in French, which we can actually translate as tent for chatting, to have a chat, and it's inviting people to come in, to sit down and chat with each other. Interestingly here is that the cords, because this work is actually made of the same materials as Cocoon, but instead of sewing the cords really together, she leaves some space in between them. So there are little threads that attach the cords. So you have these concentric circles of cords, but in between the circles, there is some space through which you can look. So there is a bigger transparency. So this transparency I was talking about already in the first mural tapestries, if I can call them like that, is now further developed in this work. It's like a tent, an open tent, through which you can look. So there is a bigger interaction between space, the environment in which the work is situated, on the one hand, and the work itself. And then also an interaction between the work and the viewer, who is invited to come in, to take a seat. There are some kind of poofs made also in the same material. I think 5 people can be seated in it, and this is a nice environment to have a chat with each other. So this I find a very interesting aspect of Tapta's work, this interaction between body and work. So there's really a much more bodily experience of the work. And this, I think, breaks with a lot of artworks from before, where especially the visual experience was important, not that much a really bodily experience.
So here the other senses are kind of invited. I mean, you are invited to perceive it with your other senses. And that was my first question that you already answered, how many people could fit there to the tent. But it's also interesting for me how you said that because of the way of connecting the chords, it is a bit transparent, that not only the viewers and the space interact with the object, but also if there are people who are inside of the tent, then it's not so much closed because it still interacts with space because of this transparency. So then the other people, the ones who are outside, they also can join this interaction somehow because they are aware of what's going on inside, and this is kind of another layer of perceiving the work and how it works on people.
Yeah, indeed.
Also, I came across the quotes from Tapta talking about her soft sculptures, and she said that in her work she shapes the textiles, but they also have their inner life. And I found it fascinating that these two forces interlace with each other, because it feels like what she does is kind of a shamanic act of taming these textiles. And I wanted to ask you whether you could tell a bit more about this idea of hers, of the soft sculpture, and the way she approached working with textiles based on that.
Yes, what is indeed very important is that she noticed and acknowledged very well that the textiles themselves have their inner life, and that the material has very specific characteristics. And she actually starts from these characteristics of the medium, of the material, to make the work, and not like in traditional tapestry, let's say, from carton, a model that needs to be precisely reproduced, you see. So it's really in the making of the textile work that authorship arises. And that is something that Tapta, by the way, just like a few other fiber artists, as they were called at that time, such as Magdalena Abakanowicz, for example, a very famous Polish artist, they wanted to stress the autonomy and authorship of the artist working with textiles, and certainly also react against conception of textile art as decorative handicrafts, mostly female handicrafts. So actually Tapta, like other often female artists in the 1960s and 70s, was separating herself from, on the one hand, traditional textile art considered rather as a decorative craft, but also, I think, from the tradition of sculpture in bronze or stone that has been defined by men for centuries. And they were finding new ways, doing new things that didn't have the weight of history. And I think we need to see these soft sculptures also in this perspective. So what is also new is something we have already stressed, but is this focus on a more bodily experience of the work rather than purely visual one.
Yeah, it feels like this softness is also more inviting to touch it and to interact with it. So in the 1970s, she created these soft sculptures. And then I also wanted to ask you about the period in her artistic practice that came later, when in the mid 1980s, she began to work with synthetic materials. And she commenced the so-called flexible period in her artistic work. And I wanted to ask, how did her approach towards the material she made her works from changed, and what was the effect of that in her practice?
Yes, indeed. In the mid 1980s, she actually left the textile medium and started to use neoprene, which is a kind of synthetic rubber, which she found more powerful than the textiles. She was also fond of industrial architecture, apparently, and found her inspiration there to use this rather industrial material of neoprene that has also some soft, flexible characteristics. So she keeps the softness and the flexible material or materiality that was already there in the textile works, but now uses a more industrial material that is black, so quite harsh actually, but still soft, still flexible. So there's this duality maybe in the material, and also even more than in the textile works, the monumentality she works with. So she was really in search of powerful works, and she found this new material could help her in that. So she actually, when she started to use the neoprene, she actually continued to work on the same core elements, and that is monumentality, spatiality, the interaction between the work and the space, and the interaction between the work and the viewer. So she developed that further in bigger and bigger installations that were supposed to stand inside a space. Then she used the neoprene. And then eventually she made also very monumental works that were situated in public space. And then she often used metal instead of neoprene because of weather conditions. It's better to use the metal.
So it seems like her aims in sculpture were kind of the same throughout the whole of her career. And these were, like you said, these interaction with space and monumentality. And it's interesting that she actually stick to the same affects that she wanted to achieve. It's just that they were either stronger or weaker throughout her careers. So she still had the same priorities, but like they came with different strengths, I would say.
Yes, indeed, indeed. Yeah, I think there's a kind of evolution also that in the textile works and also the neoprenes, but more in the textiles, there's this element of touch That we're like, we want to touch the works. When you see them, they have this very physical attraction to touch it. In the neoprenes, it's colder. It's a colder material, more smooth. And certainly in the very monumental works in public space, it's made in metal, so it's a very cold material. Also, the monumentality and the blackness of the metal do not really invite to touch, but they do kind of structure the environment in which they are situated, and they do guide you through this environment. So they still affect your behavior, let's say, as a viewer, but you're invited to walk through or around the sculpture and experience the sculpture, but also the environment in a different way. So she worked less on the touch, but more on maybe a distant experience, but still a very bodily experience, yeah.
So it's more about defining your relationship with space and how you behave, not necessarily, well, it's still a bodily experience, but it's more about your body movement in this space rather than actual tactile experience. So that's...
Indeed. Yeah, I think so. For example, she also introduced water surfaces in the monumental works at the end of her career, in which the sculpture, but also the environment is reflected. So you see, it's more about the interaction between the work and the space, rather, I would say, than the relationship between the viewer and the work.
Okay, but this is also how you said it was in the beginning, when she would make more of these works that were not so spatial, but they were, for example, on the wall, but then they reflected the lighting or the conditions of the space. So it seems like it's kind of going back to the beginning a bit. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It's very fascinating to see that in the very first works already these elements were present. She didn't develop them all directly in a very intense way, but throughout her career. And that's very nice to see and very fascinating, I think.
I also wanted to ask about something that is maybe less related to what we have talked about so far, but I'm just interested because in the 1950s, Tapta and her husband lived for 10 years in Congo. And I was curious, how has this time there affected her artistic practice, and how did she integrate with the art environment upon her arrival to Belgium? And how the forms and the environment that she witnessed there when she lived there had influenced her subsequent career in Belgium.
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. It's something that fascinates me too. And I have found some quotes in which she talks about it. So maybe it's important to know that indeed, maybe you mentioned it in the introduction, I think, that before they went to Congo, to the Belgian colony, she studied in La Cambre, which is an art school in Brussels, and she studied there textile art, which at that time was a rather technical education in weaving, not a very artistic one. So she had the techniques learned, and then she studied there between 46 and 49. And then in 1950, indeed, she and her husband, who was an engineer, went to Congo, where they lived for 10 years. So that's a pretty long period. Interesting is that she indeed took her loom with her, and she had a lot of time to experiment. I also read in an interview, I think she had a lot of free time. So there, after her very technical education in weaving, she started to experiment more and kind of get away from the purely technical art of weaving, and started, for example, to integrate metal threads in her weavings and to give them more forms. And that she'll actually then continue to do when they are back in Belgium in the 1960s, where, by the way, as it was also in your question, I think she could immediately exhibit them. And it was an immediate success, actually. What encouraged her to continue and to develop this very experimental treatment of weaving further. So she had immediately a gallery exhibition and sold many works. So she was very motivated then to continue this work. But to come back to your initial question, what is the influence on her stay in Congo on her work? Well, there are, I think, a few elements to mention. For example, the use of sisal that appears in her first mural textile works is definitely something that reminds of African art and artifacts. Also, the use of cords that hang like vines, like lianas in the jungle. So there's a reference that she also mentions herself in some interviews. But according to her, the most important influence was the notion of monumentality. We talked already a lot about it. This monumentality that she found in the African nature, in the landscape, and that she indeed pursued more and more throughout her oeuvre.
And do you think that if she didn't leave there, well, do you think that this experimentality that she comments there was the reason why she achieved such a success upon her return to Belgium? Well, I know it's difficult to say because we can only guess, but do you think these inspirations with African art were the kind of feature of her art that made the Belgium artistic environment more interested in her work, or was it more like this experimentation with materials that she could do no matter where she was?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's difficult to say, of course. And I think a stay of a decade in another continent is definitely influencing one. So it's difficult to say, but I strongly believe that indeed this factor of monumentality is very important and is something that is of major importance in her oeuvre. So I think it might have been that her work would be different if she wouldn't have been to Congo. On the other hand, there was a kind of momentum of this fiber art, so she was experimenting with these textile materials, was kind of frustrated by the way it was treated in the art school where she went, and she really wanted to get away from this handicraft use of the medium that was also reserved for women, and she wanted to get out of that. And that was, I think, a very independent movement by hers. It was only, she testifies in another interview, in 1969, when she was invited to participate in the Biennial of Tapestry in Lausanne, that she encountered, for example, the work of Magdalena Abakanovic, and that she saw that specifically in Eastern Europe, there were many artists, often female artists, working the way she was working. So also there in these other works, we see this monumentality and very spatial treatment of textile art. Voilà, so I think many factors are working there.
Okay, I will wrap it up with the last question. What is the feature of Tapta's art that you like the most? Could it be like something about her approach or a specific time, or why is her artistic practice important to you?
Well, I definitely think for me, this interaction with the viewer and this other way of experiencing a work of art. We are so educated that when we enter a museum, you cannot possibly touch an artwork or step on it. So art, modernist art, let's say, is quite distant in experience. So what I found very nice characteristic of her work is this inviting to participate in the work, to interact with the materials and also with other viewers. So this idea that art can bring people together, that can also engage in social interactions, I think is a beautiful aspect of her work.
Like this connection between different elements, like the viewer and the space and the object itself and the way they interact with each other.
Yes, indeed.
So thank you very much for this talk about Tapta. I feel like I got to know a lot that can't be maybe found that easy, because I feel like she's not as recognized as she should be based on how interesting her works are, at least here. So I'm very grateful for that.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.